pulling over his beat-up Ford F-150 on a freezing November night in Seattle. A struggling single dad thought he was simply doing the right thing by offering his worn jacket to a shivering woman in a shredded Prada gown. He never anticipated being instantly boxed in by 3 armored Cadillac Escalades, nor the red laser sights suddenly painting his chest in the dark. Most of all, he couldn't have known that helping this desperate, bleeding stranger on the wet asphalt was where his family's nightmare would truly begin. The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it seeps into your bones, carrying a bitter chill that no amount of cheap truck stop coffee can cure. For Edward Pendelton, the rain was just another obstacle in an endless marathon of survival. At 34, Edward had eyes that looked a decade older, lined with the heavy exhaustion that only a single father drowning in medical debt could understand. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. Edward was on his 14th hour of a grueling double shift as a freelance mechanic and on-call roadside assistance driver. His knuckles were permanently stained with motor oil. His bank account was overdrawn by $42, and a stack of final notice bills from Harborview Medical Center sat on his kitchen counter, back in his cramped Renton apartment. His 6-year-old daughter, Lily, had severe cystic fibrosis. The specialized nebulizer treatments cost more than his monthly rent, and the life insurance from his late wife's passing had dried up 3 years ago. Edward was running on fumes, fueled only by the singular, desperate need to keep his daughter breathing. He was navigating the slick, neon-lit streets near the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, the rhythmic thwack-thwack of his windshield wipers hypnotizing him when his headlights caught something unnatural in the darkness of an alleyway. Edward slammed his foot on the brakes. The heavy Ford F-150 skidded on the wet pavement, the tires protesting with a sharp hiss before coming to a halt. Standing in the glow of a flickering street lamp was a woman. She looked entirely out of place, like a ghost trapped in the wrong century. She was wearing what remained of a stunning, floor-length emerald green gown, the kind of dress that cost more than Edward's truck. But the luxurious fabric was shredded at the hem, stained with mud and dark splotches of blood. She was barefoot, shivering violently against a brick wall, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to ward off the biting 38-degree wind. Her blonde hair was matted to her face, and a nasty laceration across her forehead was bleeding freely, mixing with the rain tracking down her cheeks. Edward's heart hammered against his ribs. The sensible, exhausted part of his brain screamed at him to keep driving, to call 911 and let the authorities handle it. Seattle at 2 a.m. was unpredictable. It could be a trap, a mugging setup. But as he looked at her through the rain-streaked window, he didn't see a setup. He saw the same terrified, helpless look his wife had in her final days in the ICU. He threw the truck into park, leaving the engine idling, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. "Hey!" Edward called out, his voice fighting to cut through the sound of the storm. "Are you okay? Do you need an ambulance?" The woman flinched violently at the sound of his voice. She pressed herself harder against the brick wall, her eyes wide, wild, and darting around the empty street like a hunted animal. "Stay back!" she choked out, her voice barely a raspy whisper. "Don't come near me." "I'm not going to hurt you," Edward said, raising both his hands to show they were empty. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, keeping his distance. "My name is Edward. I drive a repair truck. You're freezing, ma'am. You're going to freeze to death out here. Let me help you." As he stepped closer, the street lamp illuminated her face. She was stunningly beautiful, but the sheer terror etched into her features made Edward's blood run cold. She was clutching a small, crushed black leather clutch purse to her chest as if her life depended on it. Edward didn't think twice. He unzipped his heavy, fleece-lined Carhartt jacket, his only defense against the brutal Pacific Northwest winter, and pulled it off. The frigid air instantly bit through his thin flannel shirt, but he ignored the sting. "Here," he said softly, holding the heavy brown canvas jacket out to her. "Take this. You're turning blue." The woman stared at the worn, grease-stained jacket, then looked up at Edward's face. She searched his eyes, looking for malice, looking for deception. Finding none. She reached out with a trembling, pale hand and took the jacket. As she slipped it over her bruised shoulders, she let out a long, shuddering breath, the fleece providing a small sanctuary of warmth against the freezing rain. Thank you," she stammered, pulling the oversized collar tight around her neck. I need to get to a phone. My security. They're gone. He took them out. You need to get away from me before they find." Edward frowned, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. "Before who finds?" The roar of high-performance engines shattered the quiet night. Before Edward could finish his sentence, the alleyway was suddenly bathed in blinding, high-intensity LED headlights. The beams cut through the rain like physical blades. Tires screeched in unison as three massive, black Cadillac Escalades swarmed the narrow street, moving with terrifying military precision. One blocked the front of the alley, another sealed the rear, and the third skidded to a halt diagonally, perfectly boxing in Edward's F-150. Edward's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the police. There were no sirens, no flashing red and blue lights. Just the menacing growl of V8 engines and the blinding white glare of headlights, pinning them against the brick wall. "Oh, God," the woman whispered, her voice cracking with pure despair. "They found me." Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. The heavy doors of the Escalades swung open simultaneously. 6 men stepped out into the pouring rain. They weren't street thugs. They wore matching matte black tactical gear, Kevlar vests over black raincoats, and combat boots that splashed heavily into the puddles. The rain beaded off the sleek suppressors attached to the muzzles of the compact Heckler & Koch submachine guns they carried. Red laser sights sliced through the downpour, 2 of them instantly coming to rest on Edward's chest. The glowing red dots danced lightly over his flannel shirt, right over his heart. "Do not move!" a voice boomed from the lead vehicle. The man who spoke was towering, his face obscured by the shadow of a tactical cap. "Step away from the woman, put your hands on your head, and get on your knees. Do it now, and you get to live." Edward's military training, 4 years as a motor pool mechanic in the Army, stationed at a forward operating base in Kandahar, kicked in beneath the paralyzing veil of civilian shock. He knew a professional hit squad when he saw one. They weren't here to arrest this woman. They were here to erase her. And if Edward surrendered, he knew with absolute certainty that he would be executed, right here in the alley. There were no witnesses. Nobody leaves a loose end. If he died tonight, Lily would become a ward of the state by morning. She wouldn't survive the foster system with her medical needs. She would die. That thought alone injected raw, explosive adrenaline straight into Edward's veins. "I'm sorry," the woman whispered beside him, tears spilling over her bloody cheeks. "I'm so sorry I brought this to you." "Get behind me," Edward muttered through gritted teeth. "What?" "When I say move, you dive into the passenger side of my truck. Keep your head below the dashboard. Do you understand?" "They'll kill you," she cried softly. "They're going to kill us anyway," Edward said, his eyes scanning the gaps between the SUVs. His Ford F-150 was an older model, a 2008 steel-bodied beast, heavy, battered, and equipped with a solid steel aftermarket brush guard bolted directly to the frame. It wasn't pretty, but it was a battering ram. The lead mercenary raised his weapon, the laser sight creeping up from Edward's chest to his throat. "I said on your knees. 3, 2... Move!" Edward roared. He lunged forward, grabbing the woman by the collar of his own Carhartt jacket, and shoved her violently toward the open passenger door of his truck. Simultaneously, Edward dove behind the massive engine block of the Ford, just as the distinct, muted thwip, thwip, thwip of suppressed gunfire erupted. Sparks rained down over Edward's head as bullets chewed into the brick wall and the side paneling of his truck. The glass of his passenger window exploded outward in a shower of deadly diamonds. But the woman had already scrambled onto the floorboards, screaming in terror. Edward didn't hesitate. He scrambled on his hands and knees through the mud, hauling himself into the driver's seat. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine purring faithfully. Bullets thudded heavily into the truck's tailgate. He yanked the gear shift all the way down into first gear, bypassing drive to get maximum low-end torque. "Hold on!" Edward bellowed. He slammed his work boot down on the accelerator. The Ford's tires spun furiously on the wet asphalt for a fraction of a second, screaming as they searched for traction before biting hard. The heavy truck launched forward like a missile. The mercenaries in front of him scattered, diving into the rain as the 3-ton pickup hurtled toward the lead Escalade, blocking the alley's exit. Edward braced for impact, locking his elbows. Crunch. The sound of twisting metal and shattering glass was deafening. The steel brush guard of Edward's Ford smashed into the front quarter panel of the luxury SUV with bone-jarring force. The impact threw Edward against his seatbelt, knocking the wind out of his lungs. But the momentum carried them through. The much lighter rear end of the Escalade fishtailed violently, scraping against the alley wall and tearing a gap just wide enough for the truck. Edward ground the gears, fighting the steering wheel as the side of his truck shrieked against the Cadillac. Sparks flew in a blinding arc in his rearview mirror. They burst out of the alley and onto the desolate main avenue, fishtailing wildly before Edward regained control. Behind them, the unmistakable roar of the remaining SUVs tearing out of the alley echoed through the city blocks. "Stay down!" Edward yelled to the woman on the floor. He didn't take the highway. The Escalades would easily outrun his battered truck on an open stretch of I-5. Instead, Edward plunged the F-150 into the labyrinth of downtown Seattle. He tore through a red light at 4th Avenue, tires squealing as he took a sharp right, nearly clipping a row of parked cars. He navigated the steep, rain-slicked hills, turning down narrow service roads near Pike Place Market. Using his knowledge of the city's delivery routes to his advantage, he checked his mirrors. 2 sets of aggressive headlights were weaving through the traffic 3 blocks back, closing the distance rapidly. "They're coming!" The woman sobbed from the floorboards, clutching her bleeding head. "Not for long," Edward grunted. He killed his headlights, plunging the cab into complete darkness. He took a violent left turn down an incredibly narrow brick-paved alleyway, meant only for garbage trucks, scraping the side mirrors off both sides of his truck in the process. He slammed the brakes at the end of the alley, throwing the truck into reverse, and backed the vehicle entirely into a loading dock bay, concealed by deep shadows and a row of overflowing industrial dumpsters. He killed the engine. They sat in agonizing silence, the only sound the heavy drum of rain on the metal roof and their own ragged breathing. A moment later, the 2 black Escalades roared past the mouth of the alley, their engines screaming down the main road, missing their hidden alcove entirely. Edward closed his eyes, resting his forehead against the steering wheel, his entire body trembling violently as the adrenaline began to crash. He had just rammed a luxury SUV, evaded a team of professional killers, and practically destroyed his only means of income. Are you hit?" Edward asked, his voice shaking. The woman slowly pulled herself up from the floorboards. in the dim ambient light of the city. Her face was a portrait of shock and exhaustion. She shook her head. No, I don't think so. She stared at Edward, her green eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound disbelief. Who are you? She whispered. Just a guy trying to pay rent. Edward breathed out heavily. Who the hell are you? And why is a paramilitary hit squad trying to kill you in the middle of Seattle? The woman wiped a streak of blood and rainwater from her cheek, sitting up properly on the torn vinyl seat. She looked at the dashboard, then back at Edward. My name is Victoria, she said quietly, her voice suddenly steadying with an authoritative weight that didn't match her ruined appearance. Victoria Montgomery. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Bio-Logistics. Edward stared at her. Even he, someone who barely paid attention to the news, knew that name. Meridian was a multinational titan, the company currently making headlines for a revolutionary medical patent that was about to disrupt the entire pharmaceutical industry. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., Victoria continued, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. My board of directors is supposed to vote on a hostile takeover bid by a rival conglomerate. I have the controlling shares to block it, but if I am missing or dead, the vote defaults to my COO, who has clearly been bought. She looked down at her hands, still clutching the crushed black clutch. They didn't just try to kill me. My head of security, the man who has protected me for 5 years. He pulled the gun on me in my own car. I barely managed to jump out at a red light and run. I have nowhere to go. The police are on Meridian's payroll. The private security firms are compromised. She looked up at Edward, her eyes locking onto his. If they find me before sunrise, I lose my company, and I lose my life. I have absolutely no one to trust. Edward sat in the cold, dark cab of the truck. The of her words sinking in like a stone in a pond. He was a nobody, a mechanic struggling to buy groceries, and sitting in his passenger seat, wrapped in his grease-stained coat, was a billionaire whose life was currently the center of a corporate war. We can't stay here, Edward said, finally. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cracked, older model smartphone. It was 3:15 a.m. Where can we go? Victoria asked, a hint of desperation bleeding back into her tone. If we go to a hotel, they'll check the registries. If we go to a hospital to get my head stitched up, they'll flag my name in the system. You need a place off the grid. Somewhere no high-paid corporate mercenary would ever think to look, Edward said, turning the key in the ignition. The engine choked, sputtered, and finally roared back to life, though it sounded rougher than before. 25 minutes later, Edward pulled the battered truck into the crumbling parking lot of the Whispering Pines apartment complex in Renton. The sign was missing 3 letters, and a flickering street lamp illuminated the cracked pavement dotted with weeds. It was a far cry from the gated estates of Medina or the penthouses of downtown Seattle, where Victoria Montgomery surely resided. Edward parked the truck around the back, hiding it behind a row of overflowing trash bins. Keep your head down and the hood of the jacket up, Edward instructed as they stepped out into the rain. Victoria obeyed in silence, as she followed Edward up the rusting exterior metal staircase to the 3rd floor. She took in her surroundings. The air smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and wet concrete, for a woman who spent her life in sterilized boardrooms and private jets. The sheer poverty of the environment was a sharp shock to her system. Edward unlocked door 3B and pushed it open. Quietly, he whispered. They stepped into the small, dimly lit living room. The apartment was impeccably clean, but there was no hiding the poverty. The couch was threadbare and covered with a cheap throw blanket. A small, ancient television sat on a milk crate. But what caught Victoria's attention were the medical supplies. A large oxygen concentrator sat in the corner, humming quietly. Stacks of sterile tubing and plastic nebulizer masks were neatly organized on a small folding table. Crayons and coloring books featuring princesses were neatly stacked on the coffee table. An elderly woman, fast asleep in an armchair in the corner, jerked awake as the door clicked shut. "Edward!" the woman rasped, adjusting her thick glasses. "Is that you, dear?" "It's me, Mrs. Higgins," Edward said gently, stepping forward. "I'm sorry I'm so late. Did she sleep okay?" "Like an angel," Mrs. Higgins smiled warmly, though her eyes widened slightly when she noticed Victoria standing awkwardly by the door, drenched in blood and rain. "Mrs. Higgins, this is a friend of mine," Edward said quickly. "Her car broke down in the storm. She had a bad slip and fall. I'm going to patch her up." Mrs. Higgins, clearly possessing the wisdom not to ask questions at 4 a.m., simply nodded and gathered her knitting bag. "Of course. I'll see you tomorrow night. Edward, lock the door behind me." Once the elderly woman left, Edward turned the deadbolt and threw the chain lock. He turned to Victoria and let out a long breath. "Bathroom is down the hall on the left. There's a clean towel on the rack. I'll find you some clothes." 10 minutes later, Victoria emerged from the bathroom. She had washed the mud and blood from her face. The cut on her forehead was nasty, but the bleeding had stopped. She was wearing a pair of Edward's gray sweatpants that she had to roll up at the waist and ankles, and a faded Seattle Seahawks t-shirt that hung off her frame like a dress. Her shredded Prada gown was bundled up in a plastic grocery bag in her hand. She walked into the tiny kitchenette, where Edward was boiling water on a stove with only 2 working burners. He handed her a steaming mug of tea. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. She looked around the tiny apartment again, her eyes lingering on a framed photograph on the fridge. It was a picture of Edward, looking much younger and happier, with a beautiful woman and a tiny baby. "Your wife?" Victoria asked softly. Edward paused, staring at the boiling water in the pot. "Yeah, Sarah. She passed away 3 years ago. Breast cancer. I'm so sorry." "Don't be. She fought hard." Edward turned off the stove. "The medical equipment. The oxygen. It's for my daughter, Lily. She has cystic fibrosis." Victoria's breath hitched. She looked at the sterile tubing on the table with a new, profound understanding. As the CEO of Meridian Bio-Logistics, she knew the exact crushing cost of CF treatments. She knew the merciless reality of the American healthcare system. She suddenly realized why Edward looked so hollowed out, why he was driving a tow truck at 2 a.m., and why he had risked his life without a second thought. He was a man with nothing left to lose. "You saved my life tonight, Edward," Victoria said, her voice filled with a heavy, unshakable sincerity. "If I make it to that boardroom by 8 a.m., I am going to make sure you never have to worry about a medical bill for the rest of your life. That is a promise." Edward looked at her, a cynical, tired smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Let's just worry about keeping you breathing until sunrise. Miss Montgomery, CF treatments don't mean much if we're both dead." Suddenly, Victoria's face drained of color. She dropped her mug on the counter. The ceramic shattered, hot tea spilling over the cheap linoleum. "My purse," she whispered in sheer panic. "What?" Edward asked, alarmed. "My purse. The black clutch. Did I bring it in here?" Edward quickly scanned the living room. "I don't see it. You had it in the truck." "Edward!" Victoria gasped, grabbing his arm, her manicured nails digging into his skin. "My cell phone is in that purse. It's encrypted, but Richard, my COO, he has the administrative override. If he accesses the corporate tracking software—" Edward felt the blood freeze in his veins. He didn't need to finish her sentence to know what it meant. If the phone was in the truck, transmitting a GPS signal, the heavily armed hit squad wasn't searching downtown Seattle anymore. They were already on their way to Renton. Edward didn't waste a single second panicking. The moment the shattered ceramic hit the floor, his military conditioning took over, burying his exhaustion beneath a cold, hyper-focused clarity. He lunged across the tiny living room and pressed his back against the wall next to the window, peering through a crack in the cheap plastic blinds. Down in the cracked asphalt parking lot, 3 matte black Cadillac Escalades were already rolling to a silent stop. Their headlights were extinguished, operating completely stealthily in the heavy downpour. "They're here," Edward hissed, turning away from the window. "We have less than 2 minutes before they clear the stairs." Victoria's eyes widened, the sheer terror returning to paralyze her. "Edward, your daughter—" "I know," Edward interrupted, his voice a low, commanding bark. He was already moving. "Go to the kitchen, grab the heavy black canvas bag under the sink and fill it with the medical tubing on the table. Do it now." While Victoria scrambled to obey, Edward sprinted into the single, tiny bedroom. The room was mostly taken up by a hospital-grade pediatric bed. Sleeping soundly amidst a mountain of stuffed animals was Lily. She was tiny for a 6-year-old, her skin pale, a specialized nasal cannula resting on her cheeks to help her breathe through the night. "Lilybug," Edward whispered, shaking her shoulder gently but firmly. "Hey, sweetie, I need you to wake up," Lily groaned, rubbing her eyes with tiny fists. "Daddy, is it morning?" "Not yet, baby. We're going to play a game. The silent game, okay? We have to leave right now." He didn't wait for her to fully wake. He scooped her up in his arms, wrapping her in her thickest winter quilt. He grabbed the portable oxygen concentrator, a heavy, battery-powered device the size of a toaster, and slung the strap diagonally across his chest. He rushed back into the living room. Victoria was standing there, trembling, clutching the black bag filled with Lily's sterile gear. "Take the stairs?" she asked, her voice shaking. "They'll be coming up the main stairwell," Edward said, glancing at the front door. "We're taking the fire escape. It's rusted to hell, so step exactly where I step." Edward moved to the front door and threw the deadbolt. He needed to buy them an extra 30 seconds. He grabbed a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the counter and jammed the handle under the doorknob, wedging it tightly against the cheap linoleum floor. Then, he grabbed a can of industrial WD-40 from his tool belt on the table and sprayed a massive puddle of the slick lubricant directly on the floor in front of the entryway. He ushered Victoria toward the kitchen window, shoving the sash upward. The freezing rain instantly blasted into the apartment. "Out," Edward ordered. "Go!" Victoria hiked up the oversized sweatpants, swung her legs over the sill, and stepped out onto the rusted, grated iron platform of the fire escape. Edward handed Lily through the window into Victoria's arms, the billionaire CEO who was used to delegating every physical task in her life. Instinctively tightened her grip on the fragile, blanket-wrapped child, shielding her from the driving rain. Edward climbed out last, pulling the window shut behind him, just as a dull, heavy thud echoed from inside the apartment. Someone had just kicked the front door. Edward signaled for Victoria to move. The metal stairs groaned and shrieked in protest under their weight. They descended rapidly into the darkness of the alley behind the complex. From above, they heard the splintering crack of wood as the apartment door gave way. followed immediately by the sound of heavy boots slipping wildly on the WD-40. A man cursed loudly, followed by the muffled pft of a suppressed weapon discharging into the floorboards. "Keep moving," Edward breathed, taking Lily back from Victoria so she could navigate the slippery ladder that dropped them into the muddy alley. They hit the ground running. Edward led them away from the parking lot, plunging into the dense, overgrown woods that separated the apartment complex from the nearby industrial rail yard. The rain was a blessing and a curse. It froze them to the bone, but it completely masked the sound of their escape. Behind them, flashlights began to sweep out of the third-story window, the beams cutting through the rain like searchlights. But they were already gone, swallowed by the Seattle night. By 4:45 a.m., they had walked 2 miles along the active train tracks, sticking to the deep shadows of the rusted boxcars. The cold was becoming dangerous. Lily was shivering violently in Edward's arms, her breathing growing shallow and raspy, the distinct, wet rattle that always sent ice into Edward's veins. "We need to get her inside," Victoria said, panting heavily. Her bare feet, though now clad in a pair of Edward's spare wool socks she had found in the bag, were bruised and bleeding. Yet, she hadn't complained once. "Edward, she's struggling." "I know," Edward said, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "We're almost there." 10 minutes later, they emerged from the rail yard into a gritty industrial district of South Seattle. Edward led them to a massive, corrugated metal building, surrounded by a chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire. A faded sign read, "Donovan's Imports and Salvage." Edward pounded on the heavy steel side door. A minute passed. He pounded again, harder. "Donovan, it's Artie. Open the damn door." Heavy locks turned, and the door swung open. A towering man with a thick gray beard, grease-stained overalls, and a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun, resting casually over his shoulder, glared out at them. Donovan was a former Marine combat engineer who had served 2 tours with Edward in Afghanistan. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at the shivering child, the bleeding woman, and Edward's desperate eyes. "Get in," Donovan grunted, stepping aside. The garage was cavernous, smelling of exhaust, old oil, and stale coffee. Donovan quickly turned on a small space heater in the makeshift office and tossed Victoria a heavy wool blanket. Edward immediately set Lily down on a worn leather sofa, hooking her portable nebulizer up to the oxygen tank and placing the mask over her pale face. As the machine hummed to life, delivering the life-saving medication into her lungs, Edward finally let out a ragged breath, slumping into a nearby chair. "You want to tell me why you look like you just went 12 rounds with a cartel hit squad?" Donovan asked, pouring 3 mugs of black coffee from a filthy pot. "It's complicated," Edward muttered, taking the mug. "I have time," Donovan replied, leaning against his workbench. Victoria stepped out of the office, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked at Donovan, then at Edward. "It's my fault. My Kuo, Richard Sterling. Wait, no, just Richard," she corrected herself, shaking her head. "Richard orchestrated a hostile takeover. I have the votes to stop it. But he sent a private military contractor to ensure I don't make the 8 a.m. board meeting." Donovan whistled lowly. "Corporate espionage. Fancy. Who's the rival company?" "Apex Pharmaceuticals," Victoria said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "They've been trying to buy Meridian Bio-Logistics for 2 years. We refused." Edward looked up, his eyes suddenly narrowing. "Apex, the ones who manufacture Pulmo-Breathe." Victoria nodded slowly. "Yes. Why?" Edward looked at the nebulizer mask strapped to his daughter's face. Because Pulmo Breathe is the only drug keeping my daughter alive. It costs me $4,000 a month. It doesn't cure her. It just manages the symptoms. Victoria went entirely still. The pieces clicked together in her mind with horrifying clarity. "Edward," Victoria whispered, her voice dropping to a horrified register. "The patent that Meridian is voting on today, the one Richard is trying to sell to Apex, it's a permanent gene therapy delivery system. We cracked it last month. It completely reverses the cystic fibrosis cellular mutation. It's a cure." The silence in the garage was deafening. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of Lily's nebulizer. "A cure," Edward repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Apex doesn't want to buy the patent to use it," Victoria realized, her eyes wide with disgust. "They want to buy it to bury it. If they release a cure, they lose billions of dollars in lifelong symptom management treatments. Richard is helping them kill the cure. And he's killing me to do it." Edward stared at the concrete floor. For the last 3 years, he had accepted his fate. He had accepted the poverty, the exhaustion, the agonizing fear of watching his daughter suffer. He believed it was just the cruelty of nature. Now, he was looking at the woman who had the power to save his daughter's life, and he realized that men in expensive suits were trying to murder her to protect their profit margins. When Edward finally looked up, the exhausted, desperate father was gone. In his eyes was the cold, lethal resolve of a soldier who had just been given his mission. "Donovan," Edward said, his voice hard as steel, "I need a vehicle. Fast, untraceable." Donovan grinned, a fierce, predatory smile. "I've got a '98 Honda Civic in the back. Engine is swapped. It looks like a grocery getter, but it'll outrun a police interceptor. Take it." "Can you watch Lily until this is over?" Edward asked. "With my life, brother," Donovan said, racking the shotgun for emphasis. Edward turned to Victoria. It was 5:30 a.m. "We have 2.5 hours. How do we stop Richard?" Victoria stood up taller, the billionaire CEO finally shedding the shock of the night. "If I just walk into the boardroom, his security will grab me. I need leverage. I need the physical prototype drive from our R&D facility in Bellevue. It has the encrypted proof of the drug's efficacy and the logs of Richard's illegal communications with Apex. Is the facility guarded? Heavily. And the man running the security detail is Marcus Graves. He's the one who held the gun to my head in the alley." "Good," Edward said, tossing the keys to the Civic in the air and catching them. "I want to have a word with him anyway." The sun was just beginning to turn the eastern horizon, a bruised, stormy purple, when the unassuming gray Honda Civic pulled up to the perimeter of the Meridian Bio-Logistics R&D campus in Bellevue. It was 6:45 a.m. The facility was a fortress of glass and steel, surrounded by high-security fencing and a manicured landscape that belied the heavy surveillance. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, wearing a spare mechanic's jumpsuit Donovan had given her. She had her hair pulled back into a tight bun, a baseball cap pulled low over her face. "The master drive is in the subterranean server room, sub-level 3, Victoria said, pointing to a schematic she had drawn on a greasy napkin. "Graves will have locked out my biometric access, but there is a manual override in the primary electrical junction." "Where is the junction?" Edward asked, eyeing the front gate. 2 armed guards in tactical gear, Graves's men, were patrolling the entrance. "In the loading dock, but we can't just drive in." "Watch me," Edward said. He didn't approach the main gate. Instead, he drove the Civic around to the rear of the compound, where a massive commercial garbage truck was idling outside the service entrance, waiting for the electronic gates to open. Edward pulled up right behind the massive truck, tailgating it so closely that his front bumper was practically kissing the heavy steel rear guard. "Get ready to duck," Edward warned, as the gates slowly rumbled open to let the garbage truck in. Edward hit the gas. The Civic tucked perfectly into the blind spot of the massive vehicle. The gate sensors, registering only the enormous length of the garbage truck, began to close immediately after it passed. Edward floored it, slipping the Civic through the closing gap with mere inches to spare, the metal gate scraping the rear bumper as they cleared the perimeter. He immediately banked hard right, diving down the concrete ramp toward the subterranean loading docks. He parked the car behind a stack of wooden pallets and killed the engine. "We're in," Edward whispered. They moved quickly and silently through the labyrinth of the loading dock. Edward's military background made him a ghost. He anticipated the security camera's blind spots and guided Victoria through the shadows. They reached the heavy steel doors of the primary electrical room. It was secured by a heavy magnetic lock. Edward pulled a crowbar and a small can of liquid nitrogen from his bag, a parting gift from Donovan. He sprayed the freezing liquid directly onto the magnetic lock housing. The metal frosted over instantly, crackling under the extreme temperature shift. Edward wedged the crowbar into the gap and wrenched downward with all his strength. With a sharp snap, the brittle locking mechanism shattered. Victoria slipped inside and moved to the massive array of circuit breakers. She didn't hesitate. She threw 3 massive levers in a specific sequence. Instantly, the hum of the building shifted. Emergency lights flickered on as the main grid temporarily rebooted. "That just hard reset the internal security doors," Victoria whispered. "The biometric locks will default to factory settings for exactly 90 seconds. We have to move." They sprinted down the emergency stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time until they hit sub-level 3. They burst through the doors just as the electronic locks clicked back into place. They were in a massive, hyper-cooled server room, illuminated by the eerie blue glow of data racks. In the center of the room sat a standalone terminal protected by reinforced glass. Victoria rushed to the terminal, typing furiously on the keyboard. "I'm initiating the physical extraction of the master drive," she said, her fingers flying over the keys. A mechanical whirring sound filled the room, and a small metallic cylinder the size of a cigar tube popped out of the console. Victoria grabbed it, her eyes flashing with triumph. "I have it. This is the cure, and this is Richard's death warrant." "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Ms. Montgomery." The voice echoed coldly through the server room. Edward spun around, instinctively shoving Victoria behind him. Standing in the doorway of the server room were 3 men. In the center stood the head of security, Graves. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tactical suit, and holding a customized Glock 19. The laser sight was aimed directly at Edward's forehead. "I have to admit," Graves sneered, walking slowly into the room, his boots clicking on the grated floor. "When my men lost you in the city, I thought you were dead in a ditch. Imagine my surprise when the perimeter alarms tripped. You brought a mechanic to a gunfight. Victoria." Graves gestured with his weapon. "Hand over the drive. Now." Victoria gripped the drive tightly. "You're selling out millions of sick people." Graves. "For what? A payout from Apex?" "Aye, a very large payout," Graves corrected smoothly. "Now, I won't ask again." Edward calculated the distance. 20 feet, too far to rush him, 2 armed guards flanking him. "You don't want to do this, Graves," Edward said, his voice eerily calm, shifting his weight perfectly onto the balls of his feet. "You fire that weapon in here, you risk shattering the liquid cooling lines above the servers. You'll fry the entire mainframe." Graves laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I don't care about the mainframe. I only care about that drive. Shoot the mechanic. Graves ordered the guard to his left. As the guard raised his weapon, Edward didn't freeze. He smiled, because Edward hadn't just sprayed liquid nitrogen on the door lock. On the way down the stairwell, he had noticed the primary halon fire suppression tanks for the server room, and he had taken a wrench to the manual release valve. Before the guard could pull the trigger, a deafening alarm klaxon blared through the room. "Warning! Halon gas discharge imminent! Evacuate immediately!" "What did you do?" Graves roared, spinning around. "I bought us some time," Edward said. A thunderous hiss erupted from the ceiling vents, and a blinding, suffocating cloud of thick white fire suppression gas exploded into the room, instantly plunging the server farm into absolute, chaotic blindness. The heavy, white halon gas swallowed the server room in seconds, displacing the oxygen and turning the high-tech sanctuary into a blinding, suffocating whiteout. "Stay low!" Edward shouted, his voice muffled by the thick cloud as he grabbed Victoria by the collar of her jumpsuit and pulled her down to the grated metal floor. Across the room, the sound of violent, ragged coughing echoed through the haze. Graves and his guards were caught entirely off guard, their tactical discipline fracturing as the dense chemical gas burned their lungs and blinded their eyes. "Clear the sector, find the door," Graves hacked out, his voice choked with rage and panic, the sound of his boots stumbling blindly against the server racks. Edward didn't wait to see them recover, keeping close to the floor where the air was slightly cleaner. He guided Victoria through the maze of data terminals toward the emergency exit on the opposite side of the room. They slipped through the heavy steel door, just as a stray bullet from a panicking guard's weapon pinged harmlessly off the frame, embedding itself deep into the concrete wall. Edward slammed the door shut behind them, throwing the emergency mechanical deadbolt. They scrambled up the emergency stairwell like ghosts fleeing a crypt, their lungs burning, adrenaline pumping liquid fire through their veins. They burst out onto the subterranean loading dock where the gray Honda Civic was still parked, hidden behind the wooden pallets. Victoria flung herself into the passenger seat, clutching the metallic master drive to her chest as if it were a fragile heartbeat. Edward slid behind the wheel, his hands steady despite the chaos. He turned the key, and the modified engine roared to life with an aggressive, throbbing purr. "Hold on," Edward growled. He slammed the shifter into reverse, spun the steering wheel hard, and fishtailed out from behind the pallets. He hit the accelerator, blasting toward the automated security gate just as the facility's internal klaxons began to wail in earnest. The security gate was beginning to close, but the Civic didn't slow down. Crash! The car's reinforced front bumper smashed clean through the automated gate arms, sending fiberglass and metal shards flying into the rain. The Honda launched out onto the main road, the tires squealing wildly before biting into the asphalt and rocketing away from the R&D campus. Edward glanced at the digital dashboard clock. 7:18 a.m. "We have 42 minutes, Edward said, his eyes locked on the road as he wove recklessly through the morning commuter traffic. Meridian Tower is in downtown Seattle. Traffic is already building up on the bridge. "They'll have roadblocks up," Victoria said, catching her breath, wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. "Richard knows we have the drive. He'll call in every favor to stop us before we reach the boardroom." "Then we don't take the bridge," Edward said, instead of heading toward the interstate. Edward yanked the steering wheel toward the older, industrial waterfront district, navigating a maze of container yards and shipping piers. He knew every back alley, every old service road, and every loophole in the city's grid from years of driving a tow truck at all hours of the night. Behind them, flashing red and blue lights suddenly pierced the gray morning rain, 2 local patrol cruisers, redirected by corporate dispatch, fell in behind the Civic, their sirens wailing. "Edward! Police!" Victoria gasped, looking back through the shattered rearview mirror. "They aren't real local cops," Edward said coldly, watching the way the cruisers maneuvered. "Look at the light bars. Standard municipal vehicles don't use high-intensity synchronized strobes. That's private security masquerading as highway patrol." The fake police cruisers surged forward, trying to ram the rear quarter panel of the Civic to spin them out. Edward anticipated the move. As the lead car swerved to clip them, Edward suddenly slammed on the brakes. The cruiser shot past them, unable to correct in time, and plowed hard into a stack of empty wooden pallets, piled high on the shoulder of the wet road. The second cruiser tried to swerve around them, but Edward slammed his foot back onto the gas, cutting across the lane and clipping the cruiser's front bumper with enough force to send it skidding into a guardrail. The Honda Civic roared past them, its engine screaming, leaving the disabled vehicles behind in a cloud of billows and steam. 7:42 a.m. They crossed into downtown Seattle, the massive glass and steel monolith of Meridian Tower looming ahead like a modern-day fortress. The executive boardroom on the 50th floor of Meridian Tower was a palace of polished mahogany, frosted glass, and intimidating wealth. At the head of the massive, custom-built conference table sat Richard Sterling, the chief operating officer. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver-streaked hair meticulously styled. A calm, chillingly confident smile plastered across his face. Surrounding him were the 9 members of the board of directors, murmuring anxiously among themselves. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, his voice smooth and resonant as he glanced at his Rolex. The time read 7:58 a.m. "It is deeply regrettable that Ms. Montgomery is absent this morning, given her sudden, unexplained disappearance and the gravity of our financial situation. The hostile acquisition offer from Apex Pharmaceuticals is our only viable path forward." An elderly board member, a woman named Evelyn, frowned and adjusted her glasses. "Richard, we can't simply sell out a controlling interest without Victoria present to cast her proxy shares. It violates company bylaws. Bylaws have provisions for incapacitated or missing executives." "Evelyn," Richard countered smoothly, his eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. "As COO, I am legally authorized to act in her stead when corporate stability is threatened. Now, I move that we call the vote. All in favor of accepting Apex's acquisition bid." Richard raised his hand first. 2 other board members immediately followed suit. "That's 3, Richard said calmly. "We just need a simple majority. Let's take the final count." Before Richard could finish his sentence, the heavy, soundproof mahogany double doors of the boardroom didn't just open, they violently flew inward, crashing against the interior walls with a deafening bang. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was Victoria Montgomery. She wasn't wearing her elegant emerald gown anymore. She was wearing a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit, her hair tied back in a messy bun, her face marked with soot and exhaustion. But the look in her emerald eyes was so fiercely commanding that several board members instinctively shrank back in their seats. Stepping right beside her was Edward Pendelton. He wore his worn, oil-stained Carhartt jacket, his knuckles scarred, his posture that of a man ready to go to war for everything he loved. Richard's confident smile instantly evaporated, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. "Security!" Richard barked, standing up so fast his chair screeched against the hardwood floor. "Get these intruders out of here immediately." "Sit down, Richard." Victoria's voice rang out, sharp and absolute, cutting through the silence of the room like a razor blade. She marched down the center of the mahogany table, her heavy boots clicking on the floor with every step. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like an empress, reclaiming her throne. "You can't call security, Richard," Victoria said, stopping right at the foot of the table, slamming the small metallic master drive down onto the polished wood with a sharp clack. "Because the moment you do, I'll plug this into the main AV console and broadcast every encrypted email, every offshore bank transfer, and every recorded conversation between you and Apex Pharmaceuticals regarding the deliberate suppression of our gene therapy cure." The color drained entirely from Richard's face. He looked at the metallic cylinder as if it were a live grenade. That's a fabrication," Richard stammered, his voice losing its smooth composure, cracking slightly. "She's unstable! She's been missing! She's clearly compromised!" "I am entirely of sound mind," Victoria interrupted coldly. She turned to look at the stunned members of the board. "For the past 3 years, Meridian Bio-Logistics has been on the verge of curing cystic fibrosis, a permanent, one-time treatment that completely reverses the genetic mutation. But Richard didn't want to cure millions of children, because a cure doesn't generate lifelong recurring revenue from symptom management drugs. Apex offered him $50 million in personal kickbacks to bury the patent forever. A wave of outraged gasps rippled through the board members. Evelyn looked at Richard with absolute disgust. "Is this true, Richard?" Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling with fury. Richard looked around the room, realizing the trap had completely closed. His mask of corporate charm shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered rat underneath. "You fools!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Without Apex, this company goes bankrupt by the end of the quarter. I saved us." "You didn't save anything." A quiet, gravelly voice echoed from the doorway. Richard turned. Edward stepped forward, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his eyes locked onto the disgraced COO with a chilling intensity. "My 6-year-old daughter has cystic fibrosis," Edward said quietly, walking slowly toward the head of the table. "Every single month, I watch her struggle to breathe. I work myself to the bone, breaking my back as a mechanic, just to afford the temporary treatments your company and Apex profit off of. You didn't just try to steal a company today, Richard. You tried to murder my daughter's future." Richard swallowed hard, backing away as Edward approached, the sheer intimidating presence of the single father making the corporate executive look small and pathetic. "Security won't be coming, Richard," Victoria added smoothly, tapping her watch. "Federal marshals and the SEC were notified the moment our vehicle entered the district. They're waiting in the lobby right now, as if on cue." The elevator doors down the hall chimed, and the heavy thud of official boots echoed toward the boardroom. Richard slumped back into his chair, defeated, his hands trembling as he stared down at the table. The immediate aftermath of the boardroom showdown was a blinding blur of flashing police sirens, frantic corporate lawyers, and shouting federal agents. The heavy mahogany doors of the 50th floor executive suite were held wide open by armed UARE. Marshals as Richard Clayton and his corrupted board members were systematically led out in cold, steel handcuffs. The media storm that followed would completely dominate global news networks for months, sending shockwaves through Wall Street and the entire pharmaceutical industry. Edward didn't stay for the press conferences. The moment the federal agents secured the building and the reality of the situation set in, the exhausted mechanic quietly slipped out through a rear freight elevator. He didn't want the billionaire's spotlight, the camera flashes, or the endless interviews. He just wanted to go home to his daughter. It took 3 agonizingly slow weeks for the legal dust to finally settle. During that time, Meridian Bio-Logistics went through a massive, highly publicized restructuring. Victoria Montgomery ruthlessly purged the entire executive board, rooting out anyone who had even a whispered connection to Apex Pharmaceuticals. Briggs and his tactical strike team were denied bail, locked away in a federal penitentiary, awaiting trial for attempted murder, corporate terrorism, and armed extortion. But the most monumental shift wasn't in the stock market. It was in the laboratories. On a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after the freezing, rainy night that changed everything, Edward stood in a brightly lit, sterile room at Seattle Children's Hospital. The suffocating, mechanical hum of Lily's home oxygen concentrator was absent, replaced by the quiet, steady beeping of a state-of-the-art hospital monitor. Victoria stood right beside him, wearing a sharp but understated navy blazer, her eyes fixed on the IV line connected to Lily's tiny arm. Through the clear plastic tubing flowed a pale, translucent fluid. It wasn't just another round of expensive symptom management. It was the finalized, FDA-expedited Meridian gene therapy treatment. The cellular reversal should begin taking effect within 72 hours, Victoria whispered, her voice thick with emotion, as she watched the drop chamber click steadily. By next month, her lung capacity will increase by 40%. By Christmas, Edward, her lungs will be completely clear. The genetic mutation is being overwritten as we speak. She is going to live a long, perfectly normal life. Edward placed his rough, calloused hand against the reinforced glass of the hospital window. For 3 agonizing years, he had lived in a constant state of suffocating terror, waiting for the dreaded day his daughter's lungs would finally give out. He had worked himself to the bone, sacrificing his own health, his sleep, and his sanity, just to buy her a few more months. Now, watching the cure actually flow into her veins, the colossal weight of that fear finally shattered. He dropped his head, his broad shoulders shaking uncontrollably as years of suppressed, agonizing tears finally broke free. Victoria didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply reached out, placing a firm, grounding hand on his shoulder, standing with him in the quiet sanctuary of the hospital room. She knew that this man had saved her life without a second thought, and in return, she had been given the ultimate privilege of saving his entire world. 2 weeks later, the infamous rain had returned to Seattle, but the dreary Renton apartment complex felt entirely different. A soft knock sounded at door 3B. Edward pulled it open to find Victoria standing on the rusted walkway. She wasn't accompanied by a heavy security detail, nor was she wearing a shredded designer gown. She wore a simple beige trench coat and carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio under her arm. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Victoria smiled, stepping inside as Edward gestured for her to enter. "Not at all. Lily is asleep. Actually asleep," Edward said, a brilliant, unrestrained smile lighting up his features. No coughing fits, no nebulizer masks, no panic attacks in the middle of the night. She just slept through the entire night for the first time in her life. Victoria's smile widened, her eyes crinkling with genuine joy. "I'm so glad, Edward, truly. But I came here today for another reason." She set the leather portfolio down on the small, scratched dining table and unzipped it. "Meridian is establishing a new, massive philanthropic division," Victoria explained, her tone shifting to professional, but incredibly warm. "We are distributing the CF cure globally, completely at cost, zero profit margins. But to do that effectively, we need a logistics network that can handle thousands of specialized, temperature-controlled delivery vehicles across North America. We are building a fleet from scratch, and I need someone to command it." Edward stared at the heavy contract she slid across the table. The salary printed on the first page was a number he couldn't have fathomed in a lifetime of turning wrenches. "Victoria," Edward breathed, shaking his head in disbelief. I'm just a roadside mechanic. I fix broken trucks. I don't run global supply chains. You operated under direct hostile fire, breached a military-grade security perimeter, and safely transported a high-value asset through an active combat zone. Victoria countered, her green eyes locking onto his with absolute, unshakable confidence. You are exactly the kind of man I want running my most important division. A man who refuses to quit when lives are on the line. Edward looked at the contract, then toward the slightly open door of Lily's bedroom, listening to the impossibly sweet sound of his daughter taking deep, clear breaths. The desperate, struggling single father was gone. In his place stood a man who finally had his future back. He picked up the pen. When do I start? Life can change in a single, freezing second. When Edward offered his heavy jacket to a terrified woman in the dark alleyway, he never imagined he would step into a dangerous world of corporate corruption, high-stakes espionage, and ultimate redemption. But true courage isn't about having absolutely nothing to fear. It's about standing up for what matters most when the world is closing in around you. If this incredible story of fate, resilience, and ultimate justice touched your heart today, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas.